The morning Cecily Vane was expelled from Almack's. The rain came down in sheets against the assembly room's high windows, and no one thought to open an umbrella for her. She walked out alone. Her pelisse was the color of old cream, her gloves were mended at the left thumb, and the set of her shoulders was the only dignity she had left to carry. Lady Brathwaite had said the words at a volume calculated to reach every corner of the room without technically being a shout, and every corner of the room had heard them, that Cecily Vane had been seen in Vauxhall Gardens with a man who was not her father, and not her cousin, and not her promised anything, that she had been seen in a private box, that she had been alone with him long enough for the ruin to be thorough. The season had made its verdict in the time it takes a candle to gutter. Miss Vane was cast out. The doors of Almack's did not close gently behind her. She had not been there. That was the fact. She held the way a woman holds a coal she cannot put down. She had been at home that evening, at the bedside of her younger sister Dorothea, who had a cough that frightened the household, and Mrs. Pendleton the housekeeper could have confirmed it. She had not been to Vauxhall. She did not know the man whose name Lady Brathwaite had coupled with hers. She had never seen the private box. Standing in the rain outside Almack's, watching the hired chair-bearers avoid her eyes, Cecily understood for the first time that truth was not a defense. The season had already convicted her. She was merely the last to know the sentence. What she did not yet know was that the man who had been watching the assembly room door since the moment Lady Brathwaite raised her voice was not watching out of idle curiosity. He was watching because he had heard a name spoken in a corridor 10 days before this night, and the name had been hers. And the speaker had been laughing. He was Julian Ashcroft, the Earl of Keldmere, and he did not laugh at anything. If you have ever watched a season render its verdict on a woman who had committed no sin, stay with this story. Cecily's accounting is coming. Julian Ashcroft had returned to London 6 weeks before the assembly, having spent 2 years managing his estates in Cumberland after the death of his younger brother, and he had returned with the specific quality of attention that loss produces in certain men, a stillness, a noticing, an appetite for precision in a world that seemed to him increasingly imprecise. He had known her only by the social fact of her. The solicitor's daughter who had been given a season by a generous aunt, who possessed a face that did not require the diamonds she could not afford, who had made a quiet place for herself in the assembly rooms by being genuinely useful to the elder women who preferred a companion who read. He had noticed her in the way a man notices a detail that does not fit its expected category and files it for later examination. That was all it had been. And then he had been standing in a doorway at the Farnwell Music Hall 10 days before Almack's, and had heard Lord Carfield's voice from the adjoining room, low and pleased with itself, saying that it had been simplicity itself to send the note in Miss Vane's hand, that her sister had kept her occupied all evening, and that Lady Brathwaite would hear the story by Thursday. Julian had stood very still in the doorway. He had not announced himself. He had listened to the rest of it. The name of the man Carfield had paid to be seen entering the Vauxhall box, the amusement in Carfield's voice when he explained that Miss Vane had refused his suit 3 weeks prior, the satisfaction of a man who had found a remedy more thorough than disappointment. Julian had said nothing. He had walked away from the doorway, and he had gone home, and he had spent 2 days determining what he knew and what he could prove, and what the difference between those 2 things would cost the woman who had refused the wrong man. He had been working on that distinction when the assembly room doors opened and she walked out into the rain alone. She did not see him. She was looking at nothing, which was the careful posture of someone choosing not to display what was happening to her face. And she walked toward the street with the particular precision of someone who has decided they will not stumble. He watched her stop at the curb. The chairs were not coming quickly enough. The rain was thorough. He crossed the pavement. He said, without preamble, "Come out of the rain." Cecily turned. She had seen the Earl of Keldmere at 3 or 4 assemblies over the course of the season. She had registered him the way one registers a feature of the landscape: present, notable, not addressed to her. His voice now was low and undecorated. She could not immediately locate his expression in the dark. "I am waiting for a chair," she said. "The chairs are on the far side of the square. Come under the arch." It was not a request. She had been expelled from Almack's 40 minutes ago, and her left glove was mended at the thumb, and she had nowhere particular to be. She came under the arch. He stood beside her in silence. The rain struck the pavement, and the gas lamps made shallow amber circles in the wet stone. She was aware of the width of him, the quality of his stillness, the fact that he had not looked away from the street, with the slightly averted gaze most men had adopted since the accusation had filled the room. "I was not there," she said. She had not planned to say it. "I know," he said. The word arrived so precisely that it took her a breath to understand it. "You know?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Stay where you are. I am going to find you a chair." He moved into the rain without haste. She watched him go, and her heart did something she did not permit herself to name. She spent the 4 days after Almack's in her aunt's house in Marylebone, in the particular quiet of a woman waiting to understand the exact shape of what has happened to her. Her aunt, Mrs. Forster, had been kind and frightened in equal measure. She had said that perhaps the season was not over, that perhaps Lady Brathwaite might be approached, that perhaps if Cecily were to write a letter, explaining that she had been at home with her sister. Cecily had listened and said nothing, because she understood already what her aunt had not yet understood, that a letter from her explaining her own innocence was worth precisely nothing in the arithmetic the season applied to women in her position. Letters from ruined women did not revise social verdicts. It was on the second of those 4 days that Mrs. Pendleton, the housekeeper, arrived at the door of the Marylebone house, pale and troubled, with a letter in her hand. She had been approached, she said. A man had come to the kitchen entrance of the Vane house in Portland Street, claiming he was collecting testimony on behalf of Lady Brathwaite, and he had wanted her to sign a paper saying that Miss Vane had gone out that evening and had returned late and had been in some agitation. Mrs. Pendleton had refused. The man had offered money. Mrs. Pendleton had refused again and had come directly here. Cecily sat with that information for a long time after Mrs. Pendleton had gone. The man who had done this to her was not finished doing it. He had employed a surrogate to see her cast out, and when that had been accomplished, he was now attempting to foreclose the avenue of her defense. She did not yet know who had sent the note in her name. She did not yet know who had paid the man to enter the Vauxhall box. She knew only that whoever had done these things was sufficiently organized and sufficiently determined, and had something specific to protect in her continued ruin. She sat by the window in the fading afternoon and added the details to what she knew with the habit of mind her father had given her. Names, dates, sequences, what each piece of evidence established, and what it did not. She was her father's daughter. She had grown up watching him read documents the way other men read landscapes, attending to what was absent as carefully as to what was present. She applied that habit now to her own situation and found, beneath the grief and the indignation, the clean structure of a case. A false note, a paid surrogate, an attempted suborning of a witness. Each step had required planning. Each step had required a person who was accustomed to arranging outcomes. She thought of the men who had been in her orbit this season, and considered which of them had proposed a form of possession she had declined. She arrived at a name. On the third day, the Earl of Keldmere left a card. She received him in the front sitting room with her aunt present, which was the only possible arrangement, and she was aware from the first minute of his visit that he had come with a purpose that was not social. He sat across from her in the way a man sits when he has calculated the appropriate distance and chosen it with care. He asked how she was managing in a tone that suggested the question had a practical dimension he intended to address. She said she was managing well enough. He said that he had information he thought she should have, and that he wished to share it if she was willing to hear it. Her aunt looked between them. Cecily said she was willing. He told her what he had heard in the doorway at the Farnwell musical. He was precise about the details, naming the date, the hour, the exact room, the exact words as he had been able to retain them. He named Carfield directly. He described the voice and the phrasing and the laughter. He did not soften any of it, and he did not editorialize. When he finished, he waited. Cecily looked at him for a moment. "You heard this 10 days ago," she said. "Yes," he said. "Before Almack's." "Yes." Something moved in his face that she could not quite parse, not discomfort, not apology, but the expression of a man who is holding a weight he has assigned to himself and is not asking to put down. "Why did you not come to me before?" she said. "Because," he said, his voice entirely level. "What I heard would not have been sufficient to prevent it. Carfield had already paid the surrogate and sent the note. What I needed first was something more than my own word." "And now?" she said. "Now," he said, "I have it." He produced a letter. It was written in a hand she did not recognize, on paper of good quality, and it was addressed to the Earl of Keldmere. He had tracked, he explained, the man who had entered the Vauxhall box, a young actor of poor reputation and desperate financial circumstances. The actor had written in exchange for a sum that cleared his most pressing debt. The letter named Carfield. It named the amount paid. It named the evening and the box, and the precise instruction the actor had been given. It named the note that had been sent beforehand in a woman's hand to establish the prior arrangement. Cecily read it twice. Her aunt made a small sound from the corner of the room. "What do you intend to do with this?" Cecily asked. "That," he said, "depends on what you intend to do." She thought for a moment. She looked at the letter in her hands, at the careful, specific handwriting, at the name Carfield rendered in ink by the man Carfield had paid. She thought of Mrs. Pendleton at the kitchen door. She thought of the rain outside Almack's and the chairs that were not coming and the 100 faces that had turned to hear the accusation fill the room. "I intend," she said, "to go to the source." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Havering dinner is on Thursday." She understood what he was offering. The Havering dinner was the event of the fortnight, attended by precisely the figures who had been present at Almack's. Lady Brathwaite would be there. Carfield would be there. It was the exact arena where the season's verdict had been reinforced, over 4 days of drawing-room conversation and polite destruction. "I have not been invited," she said. "You will have been," he said, "by this afternoon." He rose, and he bowed, and he left, and her aunt let out a long, slow breath from the corner of the room. "If you are still with Cecily now, you understand what Thursday meant. Leave a word below if you like, and then come back. The accounting is nearly ready. The 4 days between his visit and the Havering dinner were the longest Cecily could remember since the evening of Dorothea's cough. She spent them in a particular discipline of composure, rehearsing nothing, allowing herself nothing in the way of anticipation or plan, because she understood that what happened on Thursday depended on facts she held, and on a man whose motivations she had not yet fully parsed, and that rehearsing either would only produce a version of the evening that would not arrive. She thought about Carfield. She had refused his suit in late February, at the close of a musical very like the one at which Lord Keldmere had stood in a doorway and listened. Carfield had been smooth about it, had accepted her refusal with a courtesy that had seemed at the time almost generous. She had not seen the thing underneath it. She had not known that a man who believes himself owed a woman's consent will interpret her refusal as a declaration of hostilities rather than a conclusion. She thought about the Earl of Keldmere. She thought about the precision of him, the fact that he had gone looking for the actor rather than simply arriving with his own word, the quality of attention he had brought to a problem that was not his. She did not know what to make of it. Her experience of men with rank was that they moved through the world with the assurance of those who have never been required to consider the consequences of their inattention, and the Earl of Keldmere was doing something that did not fit that pattern, and she did not yet have a vocabulary for it. She thought about him standing in the rain. She thought about the instruction, quiet and direct, that had caused her to follow him under the arch. She stopped thinking about it and went to sit with Dorothea, whose cough was better now, and who wanted to be read to. They spent the afternoon with a volume of essays Cecily had borrowed from the Forster Library, Dorothea with her feet tucked under her on the settee and her head against her sister's shoulder. And it was almost possible, in the warmth of that room, to feel that the world outside was conducting its business without requiring anything further of them. Almost. The Havering dinner was held in a room that could seat 40 and had been arranged to seat 32, which meant that every placement was a social statement and every absence was deliberate. Cecily arrived on the arm of her aunt, who was old enough and connected enough to command an invitation, regardless of the weather around her niece. The room registered her entrance in the way rooms do. A pause, a recovery, a renewed attention that would have been invisible to anyone not paying close attention. She saw Lady Brathwaite at the far end of the table, seated in the position that indicated she was the evening's arbiter rather than merely its guest. She saw Carfield 3 places to her right, and she watched him see her, and she saw the thing that moved across his face before he assembled it back into courtesy. She was seated 6 places from Carfield and 4 from Lady Brathwaite, and she understood from the placement that Lord Keldmere had been deliberate. She had not yet seen him. She looked for him without appearing to look. The dinner proceeded with the careful ceremony of an occasion at which everyone knew something of consequence was impending, and no one wished to be the first to name it. The soup was removed. The fish arrived. The conversation at her end of the table was pleasant and circling, and she contributed to it with the sociable portion of her attention, while the rest of her attended to the room with the precision of someone who has learned that danger requires a full inventory. She was on the second remove when she became aware that the Earl of Keldmere was seated directly across the table, 6 places down, and that he had been watching the room with an attention that matched hers exactly. He met her eyes for a fraction of a second, and looked away. She understood from that fraction of a second that the moment was coming, and that she was to be ready. It came at the interval between the removes, when the conversation had swelled and the candles had burned an inch lower, and Lady Brathwaite said, clearly enough to reach the half of the table nearest her, something about the difficulty of maintaining the standards that made the season worth attending, the regrettable necessity of ensuring that the company was unimpeachable. There was a pause shaped to invite a name, and into the pause Lord Carfield said, with the smooth assurance of a man who has already won the field, that some situations simply could not be rehabilitated, that a family's name was its only permanent inheritance, and that Miss Vane, glancing down the table with a brief sympathy that was not sympathy at all, had been placed in a most unfortunate position by her own choices. The table went quiet in the way tables do when someone has said the thing everyone has been waiting to say. Cecily set down her fork. Her hands were entirely steady. She had not planned what she would say. She had known, however, that the moment would arrange itself into the space Carfield had just created, and that what she said into it would either be enough or it would not. "Lord Carfield," she said, and her voice was clear and unhurried, "is generous in his concern for my reputation. I had not expected to hear him speak so warmly on my behalf, given that he is the person who arranged its destruction." The silence was absolute. She did not look at Carfield. She looked at Lady Brathwaite, because Lady Brathwaite was the authority in the room, and because what happened in the next 30 seconds depended on whether she was a woman who could hear new information. "On the 23rd of February, Cecily said, Lord Carfield made an offer I declined. On the 7th of March, a note was sent in my name to a man I had never met, arranging a meeting I did not know about in a private box at Vauxhall I had never visited. On the 9th of March, that meeting occurred, witnessed by parties Lord Carfield had arranged to be present. On the 11th of March, this assembly heard the account. Lady Brathwaite had been given." She reached into the small evening bag beside her plate. She produced the letter, folded, and placed it on the table. "The man who entered that box has set out the arrangement in full," she said. "The instruction, the amount, the name of the person who commissioned the performance. I am glad to leave this letter with you, Lady Brathwaite, if you would care to read it." Lady Brathwaite was looking at Carfield. Carfield had gone the color of old plaster. He had opened his mouth once and closed it. The table was very still around him, and in that stillness a thing was happening to him that was the inverse of what had happened to her at Almack's. 30 pairs of eyes, all arriving at the same calculation, all arriving at it simultaneously, and all of them resting on a man who had believed himself unobservable. "Lord Carfield," Lady Brathwaite said, her voice very quiet, "I think you will want to step out." He stepped out. The letter went around the table. It came at last to the Earl of Keldmere, who read it and passed it to his neighbor without any expression at all. Cecily watched him. He did not look up. Across the table, one of Lady Havering's guests, a woman of middle years and a friend of Mrs. Forster's whose name Cecily had never retained, said quietly in the restored murmur of the room that she had never thought it right, any of it, that she had always found Miss Vane to be a woman of evident good sense. It was not addressed to anyone in particular. It was the sound the room made when a verdict turned. Cecily reached for her water glass and steadied herself against the edge of the table, and looked at no one for a moment. Then she looked up, and the Earl of Keldmere was watching her from 6 places away, and his face had the expression of a man who has measured an outcome against a cost and found the ledger balanced. In the morning, Lady Brathwaite called. She arrived at the Marylebone House at 11, which was earlier than propriety required, and precisely what that earliness signaled, that she had spent the night revising her arithmetic. She sat across from Cecily in the front sitting room, without Mrs. Forster, which was a statement of its own, and she said that she had been deceived, and that she was not accustomed to being deceived, and that she wished it to be understood that the matter of Almack's was resolved. She said it in the tone of a woman who has corrected an error she was not responsible for producing, but who accepts the weight of it regardless, which was, Cecily understood, as close to an apology as Lady Brathwaite's entire architecture of self was capable of generating. "I am grateful," Cecily said simply. Lady Brathwaite looked at her for a moment. "You handled yourself with considerable composure last evening," she said. "I would not have expected less, given your father's profession. Solicitors' daughters are accustomed to presenting cases. There was nothing overtly unkind about it. There was, however, in the phrase solicitor's daughters, the faint outline of a category that Lady Brathwaite had not yet fully revised. Cecily heard it, and said nothing. Some things corrected themselves slowly. The important correction had been made. After she left, Cecily sat for a while in the quiet of the room. Dorothea came downstairs and sat beside her on the settee and took her hand without speaking, because Dorothea was 17 and perceptive in the way younger sisters are perceptive, and she could see that her sister needed a hand to hold, rather than conversation. They sat like that for some time. Outside, April was conducting itself in the usual manner of April in London, gray and intermittently hopeful, the kind of light that cannot quite commit. It was, Cecily thought, a fair approximation of how one felt after a long ordeal had ended, and the exact shape of what came next had not yet declared itself. The Earl of Keldmere came at 2. He was shown into the sitting room, and Cecily stood to receive him, and her aunt remained at the far end of the room with a piece of needlework she did not work on. He looked as he always looked, composed, attentive, present in the full weight of the word. He was carrying his hat. He set it on a side table and stood in the center of the room, in a way that was neither tentative nor entirely at ease. "Lady Brathwaite came this morning," Cecily said. "I know," he said. "I called on her before she left for Marylebone." She looked at him. "To say what?" "To say," he said, "that I had been present at the Farnwell Musicale and had heard what I told you I heard, and that I was willing to repeat it before any company she cared to name. And to say that Miss Vane's father had been my father's solicitor for 20 years and had been a man of considerable honesty, and that I had no difficulty understanding where she had learned it." Cecily was quiet for a moment. The thing in her chest was not a comfortable thing. It was large and had edges. "You did not need to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. He was looking at her with an attention that was not the attention of a man conducting a social call. It was the same quality he had brought to the doorway at the Farnwell Musicale, to the actor's letter, to the placement of seats at the Havering table, a thoroughness, a willingness to go to the full trouble of what a thing required. "Miss Vane," he said. Then, after a breath, "Cecily." Her name in his voice was different from any context in which she had heard it before. He said it the way a man says a word he has been considering for some time and has now decided to use. "I came because I want to ask you something," he said. "Not as a courtesy. Not as the resolution of an obligation. I came because I have been thinking about you since the morning you walked out of Almack's, and not only because of what Carfield arranged. I think you know that." She looked at him. Her aunt's needlework made no sound. "I was not certain," she said, which was not entirely true. "I have been uncertain how to say this precisely," he said, "so I will say it simply. I would like your permission to call on you. Regularly. With a specific intention. I would not wish to produce another arrangement that you must decline because it does not suit you. So I am asking first whether the possibility would be welcome." The room was very quiet. Outside, the street was doing what London streets do in April. A carriage, a boy calling something, the specific quality of mid-afternoon light through clean glass. Cecily was aware of all of it with unusual clarity, the way one is aware of the details of a moment one suspects will matter later. She thought of the rain outside Almack's. She thought of a voice in the dark saying, "Come under the arch," and the quality of certainty in it, and the way she had followed without quite knowing why, except that the certainty was worth following. She thought of a letter carefully obtained, a visit precisely timed, a conversation with Lady Brathwaite that she had not been told about until after. She thought of him standing across the table at the Havering dinner, watching the room with an attention that matched hers exactly, and the fraction of a second in which he had told her, without a word, that he was ready. "Yes," she said. "It would be welcome." Something in his face moved. It was not dramatic. It was the movement of a man who has been holding a breath for longer than he realized and has been given permission to release it. He was not a man who smiled easily, she had already understood, but the corner of his mouth shifted into something quiet and specific that she thought she might spend some time learning to read. "Thank you," he said. He picked up his hat from the side table. "I will come on Tuesday, if that is agreeable." "Tuesday," she said, "is agreeable." He bowed and he left, and her aunt set down her needlework and looked at Cecily with an expression that contained several years' worth of relief compressed into a single glance. The calling proceeded with the deliberate pace of a man who had decided to do a thing correctly after a season's worth of watching what happened when things were done carelessly. He came on Tuesdays and on Thursdays, and he brought books twice, because he had noticed her manner of sitting with Mrs. Havering's elderly mother during the dinner, and had correctly inferred an appetite for reading. He asked her once about her father's practice, and she spoke about it with more freedom than she had allowed herself in most company. The specific cases, the precision of language required, the way a document could mean two different things to two people reading it in good faith. And he listened without the particular quality of patience that is actually impatience disciplined, but with genuine interest that did not require management. He was careful about propriety in all of it, which she appreciated not as a formal concession, but as a form of attention. He understood that a woman whose reputation had required defending once already had particular reason to value the conventions that protected it, and he observed them without being asked. He did not linger past the hour. He did not conduct their conversations with an ear to the drawing-room door. He spoke to her aunt with the same quality of direct courtesy he extended to Cecily herself, which was the thing that told her, more than anything else he did, that his respect was not an arrangement. In late April, walking with her on the Forsters' terrace, while her aunt sat visible through the glass, he told her about his brother. He did not do it as a performance of openness. He did it because they were talking about Cumberland, where she had never been, and he was describing the valley and the fells and the quality of the light in November. And then he said that his brother had liked November best, had said there was a particular satisfaction in the bleakness of it, and the words his brother had become past tense without ceremony, and Cecily had heard it. She did not say she was sorry. She knew enough about grief to know that the word required constant service, and returned little. She asked instead what his brother's name had been. "Edmund," he said. She asked what Edmund had liked besides November. He told her. He told her about Edmund's habit of leaving books face down on the arm of whatever chair he had occupied, which had been a source of sustained domestic conflict over the years, and about Edmund's tendency to befriend horses and servants with the same easy warmth he had never managed to produce for his own rank, and about the way he had of making a room feel less formal simply by entering it, which Julian had always admired and never been able to replicate, and about the morning in December 2 years ago when it had become clear that the cough the household had been explaining as a winter complaint was not a winter complaint. He spoke for a long time. She listened. When he had finished, she said that Edmund sounded like a person it would have been good to know. He looked at her for a moment with a precision that felt like the same thing as the letter obtained from the actor, the same thoroughness, the same willingness to go to the trouble of finding out what was actually there. Yes, he said. He was. They stood in the April light for a moment, at a proper distance from one another, on the Forsters' terrace, while her aunt remained visible through the glass, and a sparrow conducted its business in the potted laurel beside the door. She was aware of exactly where he was in the particular heightened way she was always aware of him at close distance. The width of his coat, the steadiness of his hands, the slight tension around his eyes that appeared when he was saying something he had not said to anyone in some time. "I would like to show you Cumberland," he said then. She was quiet. I am not in a position to show you Cumberland without making a particular prior arrangement, he said. I would not ask that arrangement of you lightly. I know, she said. I am asking it, he said. The words landed simply, without decoration, in the way the best things he said always landed. She thought of the specific shape of Tuesday and Thursday over the preceding weeks, the books, the question about her father's practice, the name Edmund spoken with the quality of a thing that had been carried privately for 2 years and was now trusted to another's keeping. She thought of Dorothea, whose cough was gone now, who had said over breakfast last week that she liked the Earl of Keldmere, because he seemed to her to be a person who had already thought about most things and found them worth the effort. High praise from Dorothea, who was not easily impressed. She thought of Carfield, and of the rain, and of the arch, and of the particular instruction come under the arch, which had been in its way the beginning of all of it. She thought of her father, who had spent a professional life determining which arrangements were sound and which were not, and who had said to her once, when she was 12, and had asked him how one could be certain, that certainty was not the thing one was after. Care was the thing, and careful work, and paying attention to what the evidence actually contained rather than what one wished it to contain. She thought of the Earl of Keldmere tracking an actor across the city to obtain a letter no one else had thought to find, and of the card left on the 3rd day, and of 6 places across a dining table and a fraction of a second. I would like to see Cumberland, she said. The arrangement was made with a solicitor, which struck Cecily as fitting. He had engaged her father's former partner, a careful man named Whitmore, who was known to her and to her aunt, and Whitmore drew up the settlement with the precision her father would have appreciated and the attention to her specific interests that told her Julian had given Whitmore particular instruction on that point. She did not cry when she read it. She sat with it for a long moment and understood that a man who had taken this care had thought seriously about what it meant to provide for another person rather than to acquire one. The ceremony itself was small. The Forster drawing room was arranged with flowers by Dorothea, who had a talent for such things and had been applying it with considerable energy since the announcement. Mrs. Forster wept in the comfortable way of women for whom an occasion's emotion is a species of pleasure rather than distress. The Havering couple was present because Lady Havering had said afterward that the Thursday dinner had been the most interesting she had hosted in 11 years, and she intended to maintain the connection. Whitmore was present with the documents. The ceremony was conducted by a vicar who was brief and sincere, and who appeared to understand that the occasion had its own gravity and required no supplementation from him. When Julian said her name in the formal words of the service, it had the same quality it had had in the Forster sitting room in March, the quality of a word considered and then used with purpose, and she felt the thing in her chest that was not comfortable and had edges expand into something that was perhaps larger and less easily held, but which was, she understood, simply the shape of this. They rode north in the 2nd week of May. The journey took 3 days, with an overnight at an inn in York, where the innkeeper's wife brought soup to their private parlor without being asked, which Cecily took as a good sign. On the 2nd day, somewhere past Darlington, Julian fell asleep in the corner of the carriage with his hat over his face, which was the first time she had seen him do anything that could be described as unguarded, and she found herself looking at him with a warmth that had no particular name and did not require one. Dorothea had pressed into her hands at the door a small package which Cecily had opened in the carriage on the first morning to find a miniature of their father in a frame she recognized as the one that had sat on his study desk. She had not known Dorothea had kept it safe through the weeks of the Marylebone House and the disruption of the season. She held it in both hands for a long moment, feeling the familiar weight of it, the particular warmth the metal took on from a held hand. She wrapped it carefully and set it inside her reticule. Julian, across from her, had watched her without speaking. The valley appeared through the carriage window on the third afternoon, when the light was doing precisely what he had said it did, coming through at a long angle between two fells, warm and specific. Not the light of the season's ballrooms, but something older and less performed. The stone manor sat in the middle distance, gray and settled, with a walled garden whose walls had moss on them and whose gate stood open. She looked at it for a long time. "Well," he said quietly. It was not a question. She looked at him. Something in her face told him whatever answer the word had wanted, because the corner of his mouth shifted in the way she had been learning to read since March. And he looked out the window also, at the valley and the old stone and the gate standing open in the late afternoon light. That evening, in the library that had floor-to-ceiling shelves and a fire that had been laid before their arrival, and a copy of Cowper's poems open face down on the table by the chair nearest the window, she understood immediately that the habit had been Edmund's, and that it had never been corrected. She stood beside the table and looked at the book, and then looked at Julian, who was also looking at it. "I leave them where they are," he said. Not by way of explanation. By way of saying that some things one keeps. She understood. She sat in the chair on the other side of the fireplace and took the miniature of her father from her reticule and held it in her palm. The fire was the particular fire of a room that has been kept in someone's absence and has remembered how to be warm. Outside the library windows, the last of the light was doing what he had said it did in November, which was not far off now that she thought about it. A long, slow closing. A quality of patience in the sky above the fells. She did not feel, for the first time in a long season, that she was required to defend the fact of her own presence anywhere. Across the hearth, Julian was reading, or pretending to read, and she was aware of him the way she was always aware of him, with that particular precision. And she understood from the quality of his stillness that he was aware of her also, and that neither of them required the awareness to be acknowledged in order for it to be real. The gate in the garden wall remained open through the evening. She could see it from the window when she looked, which she did once, just before the last of the light went, and the stone of it held the day's warmth in the way old stone does, not dramatically, but stubbornly, long after the air itself had cooled. She set her father's miniature on the table beside Cowper's poems and left it there, where it belonged. If Cecily's story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. It is good to know who else is watching for the ones the season chooses not to see.